some really interesting new data on stimulus checks and how they made such an incredible impact on the lives of Americans. The perfect person to come here and talk about it.
Indeed, a young up-and-comer you may just be learning about, the host of Secular Talk, and also the co-host of a little podcast you might want to check out called Crystal Kyle and Friends. The one and only Kyle Kulinski. Great to see you, sir.
Hello.
Good to see you, Kyle.
I take issue with the young thing because everybody could clearly see under these bright lights the gray hair.
Listen,
everybody knows I've been on YouTube since 2012.
If you're not young, then I'm need to be in the nursing home. So we're sticking with young for you.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll meet you in the nursing home.
So what do you make of what's happening here, Kyle? So Jeff Stein, we'll put his tweet up there on the screen. After $1,400 stimulus checks, we had a 42% decline in food shortages, 43% decline in gauge of financial instability, and 20% decline in anxiety and depression. I actually think this busts a lot of myths around how exactly money from the government actually can have such a substantial impact on people's lives.
Well, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of that UBI study from Stockton, California.
That's right.
Yeah.
Where they tracked it very closely. Now, it was only $500 a month for that study, but the amount of the money that went to things that you would typically view as like a vice that people would look down on, like drinking or gambling or whatever it may be. If I remember correctly, it was about 2% of the money went for that, and the overwhelming majority went for like food, paying the electricity bill, rent,
clothes,
Yeah, and a point that you made about that is there was a guy who really wanted a new job, a better job, but he couldn't get a day off in order to go interview for a new job, and getting that $500 made it so that he was able to actually go out and interview for a new job, and he got the job, and now he makes better money, and now he's much happier. So, I mean, listen, we've been fed propaganda for decades about how the government can't do any good, and if you give somebody a government check, you're basically fostering laziness. It turns out that's just factually incorrect, and most people have some sort of drive or passion to do something in some kind of workplace, whether they're an entrepreneur or they're working for somebody in a field that they want. And so this doesn't disincentivize work. If anything, it just eases the burden and the pain and the hurt of living in a very rapacious capitalist system that's dog eat dog, where everybody's sort of clawing at everybody else's face.
And $1,400 was actually less than the bare minimum of what people should have gotten. And when you read the interviews that they did with people for whom this was life-changing in this New York Times article, they're like, I was able to feed my kids 3 times a day again. I was able to go get treatment for my cancer. I was able to get the electricity turned back on in my house. And it just makes you realize, like, for want of this small amount of money, you are immiserating people. I wonder, Kyle, do you think that it changes? Like, do you think that the fact that people got these couple of checks and were able to see in this super tangible way, like, oh, the government actually can make a difference in my life in a really simple and straightforward way, like, do you think that that ultimately shifts our politics in any way?
Well, I mean, it has shifted our politics in the sense that the polls show the people are like, this is awesome, let's do more of this.
Yeah.
Like the support for universal basic income is through the roof, when not that long ago, like 2 or 3 years ago, the polls were way under 50%. So the people have moved. But unfortunately, like virtually every other issue in our politics, that doesn't necessarily mean that the federal government is going to move on that and stay in that position. Because, I mean, we could go through the numbers all day long. 70% support Medicare for all, 80% support raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The list goes on and on. When you look at stuff like gun reform, it's like, background checks are over 90%. But that doesn't necessarily reflect in terms of policy and what Washington, D.C. is doing, because they're representing big corporate donors, and they're really the last people who want these sorts of policies to be implemented. So really, it's like, among the people, we're in a social democratic era. We're in a post-Reagan era. But in terms of the way that they're governing in D.C., we're still largely in that Reagan era, although there are, little derivatives here and there out of sheer necessity because of a pandemic and what was effectively a depression.
The problem I see is that right now, there are 2 ways to look at what happened with COVID. There was, in the beginning, an era of transformative change, which is that Trump could have completely remade American society. He could have made this is the populist era. We could, redistributive cash, rebuilding a national project. He chose the complete opposite. We entered a more libertarian politics. And Biden explicitly came in with going back to normal, which actually rejects cash politics. Of course, he did, embrace it in the beginning, but let's be honest. I mean, this is a flash in the pan moment. So that is really where I wonder how you see it. I already see a return to the 1990s politics, which is that I don't think another check is ever hitting a bank again in the next 10 years. Simply because, and I actually see this among some of my more Republican friends will often point to this, which is that working class white men, GOP based, are the #1 opponents actually of unassisted cash welfare and of unassisted cash checks. Very, very susceptible to work requirements and more. You could talk to your blue in the face about studies, and a lot of people just don't care. So I just don't know whether this changes politics or not, right?
Well, here's what I'm afraid of, and this is what I currently see unfolding. What I'm afraid of is now the rhetoric in DC is going to catch up to the polling data and the people, where now politicians will go out there and talk about how, hey, I'm helping you out. Hey, I expanded the child tax credit. Hey, I wanted to cut you a stimulus check. Hey, I wanted to give you this sort of money and that sort of money. So the rhetoric is going to catch up. In the same way that the rhetoric of like the left is winning is catching up and Biden's the new FDR is catching up. So they're now changing the narrative in terms of how this stuff is discussed. But again, substantively, not much is changing. So now the trick is like, just believe our words about how left we are and about how much we're helping you and about how much cash we're doling out. But in terms of our actions, it's going to lag way behind. And this is sort of a way, especially with left Congress people, to sort of like pat them on the back and be like, you guys are doing a great job. I hope you know how much you're influencing President Biden. I mean, he's totally bending to your will in every way. And then, of course, it's just status quo business as usual. And these people can't wait to have their ego stroked. So the second they get their ego stroked, they forget how to fight for any of these things. So it's actually the worst of all worlds because Reaganomics continues, but you have the rhetoric sounding more progressive and people sort of being deluded into the idea that we've already won a lot of these left-wing battles, even though the main ones are nowhere to be seen.
Well, so how do you reflect on, as one of the founders of the Justice Democrats, you know, the people who have been elected as part of that movement to, you know, challenge the Democratic establishment, et cetera? I mean, in the Biden era, certainly, especially, I mean, this was maybe the one that was most disheartening to me, like with the Capitol Police funding. They're providing the votes to serve power and serve the Democratic establishment agenda. Is it just that we need to keep trying in that direction and eventually maybe Nina Turner gets there and you've got some leadership? Or do you think that that model in general is just not workable or not a success?
So I have ideas and preferences as to what I think is the best and what I think is more likely to work. But substantively, I think you really need to do an all of the above approach. And when I say that, I mean, yes, you have to still try to take over at least one of the two major parties. Yes, people who are trying for a third party route, even though I think it's largely fruitless and they're going to do terribly, I think they should still go down that path. And I also think effectively like almost anti-politics roles work too, where you get directly involved building unions, some sort of general strike, large protest movements, you know, fighting on specific issues, even at the state level and the local level. I think that's the path forward. In terms of grading Justice Democrats and how they did, I think they've been a miserable failure. And the reason I think they've been a miserable failure is because I know, as a co-founder of Justice Democrats, the whole idea was you are going to be a Tea Party of the left. I want you to hold the Democratic leadership just as accountable as you hold the Republican leadership, because famously, John Boehner hated the Tea Party just as much as he hated the Democrats and hated Obama.
They drove him out of Congress.
That's exactly right.
He still hates them.
He wrote a book 10 years later being like, screw you.
They don't even have the correct strategy being implemented right now. It's not even that they're doing the strategy I want and they're doing it poorly. They're just not even doing the strategy. If they were doing the strategy, they would find maneuvers they could use. Like, for example, there's enough of them to block all legislation.
That's right.
Why don't you block all legislation and say, I'm not going to stop blocking it until Joe Biden takes out his pen and legalizes marijuana through executive order, because he can do that. I'm also going to say, you have to at least eliminate $50,000 worth of student debt. In reality, he should do all of it, but he has the legal authority to do it through executive order. So if you really want to play the kind of politics that I'm in favor of, that's what you fucking do. Because guess what? Even if the media attacks you, and they're going to attack you, you can fucking fight back. These people are scared of their own shadow. Like, oh my God, CNN came after me. Their -8 fans are gonna hate me. I don't give a fuck. Fight back. Say, I'm fighting for the people.
I remember when the Tea Party was willing to hold up the full faith and credit of the United States over like literally like a moderate increase in the American debt. So,
Well, let me ask you though, do you think that that's like inevitable? Are these personal failings specific to these individual lawmakers? Or is this just like the system is always going to create this outcome for the left?
That's a great question. So it's both. It's both things. I think there are both individual failings, and I think it's systemic as well. Where I differ from some of my lefty friends is that a lot of people like to argue that like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and fill in the blank with whatever Justice Democrat, they're now corrupt just like Nancy Pelosi. No, words have meaning. The word corrupt means something very specific. You're taking money from certain donors and you're doing favors for them. That's what corrupt means. They're not doing that. They're not corrupt. They're just simply not the same as Nancy Pelosi. So you're fucking factually wrong if you make that case. But they do have DC brain, which is basically a rotten brain where you get there and you're involved in the culture. You're surrounded by these people. These are people you fucking eat lunch with and see every day and you learn their personal stories. And so now the group thing takes over. And you don't want to be the sore thumb that sticks out.
The game mentality.
You don't want to be the sore thumb that sticks out because guess what? If you do the sort of grandstanding fighting politics that I want you to do, everybody's going to fucking hate you. Everybody in DC is going to hate you. Everybody in the media is going to hate you. It's a lonely fucking world. So guess what? That's where the individual failing comes in because even though it's really hard and you're really pushed in the direction of don't do anything, don't rock the boat, that's why we sent you there. So you have to stand up and fight. You have to be willing to be hated by all of them.
I will just say again, the Tea Party didn't give a shit, and they were fine.
Yeah.
They actually, do you remember Joe Wilson, the guy who shouted, "You lie" at Obama?
Yeah.
He made $1 million in a single day. So politically, this strategy works. You just actually have to be willing to fight for something. So anyways, Kyle, we really appreciate you joining us, man. I think the reflections on Justice Democrats and just hooking it to the stimulus checks and what it does tell us about politics today. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks, man.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and congrats on your guys' massive launch and success.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Kyle.